Venerable Sirs and dear friends in the Dhamma, good evening everyone. Today's topic is Buddhism, a religion, a philosophy, or a way of life. And I'll try to deal with these different aspects of Buddhism. Basically, I think it is something of all of these three. You know, we can say Buddhism is a type of religion in the sense that there is a founder, the Buddha himself, Sakyamuni, the Gautama, the Buddha, and then he had followers, monks and nuns, bhikkhu, bhikkhuni, upasaka, upasika, laymen and laywomen as followers. He had his teachings and his preachings later on, written down, first of all handed down orally from generation to generation for a couple of 100 years. And then there were temples coming up, places of worship, places of teaching, places of residence for the monks and nuns. And then there were rites and rituals also during those times, like Bodhi pujas and Gilampasa and Buddha Puja. Well, Buddha Puja nowadays, of course, we do, instead of the living Buddha, we have the statue in front of which we give the first part of the meal that we offer to the Sangha. So it became Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, the Buddha, his teachings, and the followers, ordained ones, bhikkhu, bhikkhunis, and then the lay people, became a sort of an organized religion. But the word religion, originally according to the Latin meaning of the word religare, or even in the Italian language, religare means something like to bind back something to something, to bind back the soul to the God in a way. Now in that sense, of course, Buddhism is not a religion like most other religions which are theocentric, where God is central. In Buddhism, God is not central. Actually, some people say the Buddha did not believe in a creator God, or he doesn't really mention a creator God. And man and woman, but mankind, individual, seems to be central in the Buddha's teachings. So in that sense, well, there was a time when people asked from the Buddha, is there such a thing as a creator God? And the Buddha kept silent, and he smiled. And then they said, well, in that case, some others said, is there then no God? And the Buddha kept silent and smiled. Then they asked him, why do you keep silent and smiling? He said, well, if I would say that there is a creator God, some people might accuse me of being an eternalist, and some people might accuse me, if I say that there's no God, they might accuse me of being a annihilationist or a nihilist, believing in nothing. So therefore, I keep away from these two extreme views, as he called it. So, and he said also that rather than trying to find out where it all came from and what was the beginning of this, all this, which we cannot really find out logically and even by remembering and trying to figure out what was first thing here, it is more or less like the question, which was here first, the chicken or the egg, was it the chicken which laid the egg or the egg which grew into a chicken? And who created that egg or who created that chicken in the first place? So we cannot really find the answer, and we might be thinking about the answer and suddenly we might fall sick and die before we find the answer. So the Buddha said, don't worry about these kind of speculative questions, but rather focus on the situation in this lifetime and find out whether you are happy or unhappy, whether you have a problem, whether you have dukkha or, suffering, and where this suffering comes from. And if you can overcome this suffering, then you have reached your goal. And then maybe a lot of other things will become clear. So the Buddha actually taught systematically, in a way, the fact of dukkha or unsatisfactoriness, suffering as it is sometimes called, which is not a very good, not a satisfactory translation of the word dukkha. The word unsatisfactoriness for dukkha is much better, because basically the Buddha said everything under the sun and everything that we can see and hear and smell and taste and touch and even think about, and all the things around us, they are basically composed of factors that come together and fall apart. They are, in a way, impermanent and never the same, although some things seem to last longer than others. Some things look more permanent than others. Like diamonds, for instance, look like forever, James Bond said, diamonds are forever. But if you really look into the diamond deeply, that is under the electronic microscope, and go deeper and deeper, maybe to the subatomic level, you might actually find that even the diamond doesn't really exist as matter, but is just a condensation of energy. So it all depends how you look at it. So the Buddha said there are these different levels of reality. Also, the relative reality, where we say the diamond is very expensive, very, very costly, very, very valuable, and permanent, and so on. But if you look at the real level of reality, then you may find it's the absolute truth of the matter is that there's no matter, just energy. But we cannot live like that. We have to have, gold and diamonds and water and food and everything in the world to sustain us. So these relative things are relatively true, but from an absolute sort of point of view, they're just impermanent and not really me, mine, or my own. And therefore, they cannot be called really satisfactory. So Buddha was teaching basically a kind of, you could say, a philosophy, but not really a philosophy based on just theory. It was not a theoretical philosophy somewhere floating in the air based on assumptions, but a very practical kind of philosophy based on his own observation and based on the reality of, the things as they are, as the Buddha said. To see the things as they really are could solve a lot of our problems. Because, as he said, in the second noble truth, that the causes of our unsatisfactoriness or dukkha as we experience it are basically found within ourselves. Just like we can experience dukkha, we can also try to find out where does this dukkha or unsatisfactoriness come from. And basically the Buddha said there are three types of delusions that we are suffering under. Namely, we tend to project some kind of permanence onto impermanent things. The reality is that it is impermanent, but we hope or we think that things are more permanent than they really are. Like we would like to have the things around us, the people around us, the situations around us as they are, especially, of course, if they are pleasant, not the unpleasant ones. We sort of shove that to the side and we don't want to think about that. But the pleasant things we hope that are permanent, and the unpleasant things we hope that they're impermanent. But that's not realistic, you see. So in a sense, some people who say, well, the Buddha was saying, when you take the old translation of the word dukkha as suffering, and you see the first noble truth that birth is suffering, Growing up is suffering, growing older is suffering, getting sick is suffering, to get what you don't want is suffering, to get what you don't want is suffering, to be separated from those whom you love is suffering, and then getting sick and dying is suffering. So if you hear that word suffering, 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 suffering all the time, from birth to death everything is suffering, then you might think that the Buddha was a real pessimist. But actually that suffering translation suffers from being not a good translation, and therefore unsatisfactoriness comes much closer to the real meaning of dukkha. It is just not able to give us 100% and eternal happiness. All these things are conditioned, and therefore it depends on what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, and what you think, whether you are feeling happy or unhappy. That is the worldly kind of reality of the objects that we as human beings, with our six senses working, come under. When we come in contact with the world, that's what we experience. And of course, most people, generally speaking, all beings, hope for happiness. They're striving after happiness. They're searching for happiness. They like happiness and they dislike unhappiness. So they're trying to avoid unhappiness and search for happiness. But sometimes, because of our delusion, we don't know what is real happiness. So we search for happiness just only in what is called the worldly objects. And then, of course, the Buddha said, yes, if you keep on searching for your real happiness only in the worldly objects, then you're making a mistake, because those worldly objects can never give you 100% satisfaction or happiness, because they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have a cause and an effect. They don't last. They may change into their opposite. You may lose them. That leads to fear if you are attached to them, and so on and so on. So therefore, Buddha said, we have to look at worldly happiness on the one hand is not wrong, or not that you should not be happy. Some people get that impression of Buddhism, we shouldn't look at beautiful things or hear beautiful sounds and things like that, but it's not like that. We can be happy in the worldly sense also, and even the Buddha gave instructions on how to get worldly happiness, what to do, the duties of a husband to the wife, and the wife to the husband, the parents to the children to the parents, to the teachers and to the pupils, and then to the employers and the employees, and to the holy people, the clergy, and so on. All those things Buddha has explained, and even what kind of things lead to your downfall and what kind of things lead to your, let's say, material welfare also Buddha gave advice. So on one hand, he gave a lot of worldly instructions, but on the other hand, he also gave us spiritual advice, how to find real happiness that is not dependent on seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and, feeling and thought. So the Buddha actually gave a complete sort of path from suffering to the end of suffering, to go from this side of the stream or of the river to the other shore. And he taught us a kind of swimology. You know that? Swimology is the word used in a very funny story, yes, learn how to swim, not the knowledge about swimming. Because there was this professor who thought that he knew a lot, and actually he knew a lot, and he was sort of proud of that as well. And this professor went on a trip on a ship, like a cruise, and he was having a chat with the sailor every evening in this room about this, that, and the other, and he was trying to show off his knowledge. Well, he was trying to share, let's say, his knowledge. And he would ask from the sailor, do you know about astronomy? What's that? He asked, I'm not learned one, I'm just sailing. He said, you've been sailing your whole life, but you don't know what astronomy is. There are all these stars and you don't know about it. So let me tell you about it. You have wasted a quarter of your life, he says to the sailor. Then the next evening he asks, do you know about oceanography? What is that? The sailor asks. Well, you know, the science of the oceans and so on. And he gives him a lesson in that. And he said, you have wasted another quarter of your life not knowing this. And then the third evening, do you know about geology? What is that? Well, that is this. And then you have wasted yet another quarter of your life. So on the fourth evening, a big wind, a storm comes, and the ship is going like this, and it's about to capsize, and the sailor comes running to the professor and says, Professor, do you know swimology? And the professor, he says, sorry, I cannot swim. He said, I'm very sorry, but then you have wasted your whole life. You see? Well, so it's very important to know how to swim from this side, that is dukkha, to the other side, which is nirvana. So not just the theoretical knowledge, but also the way how to get there, from suffering to happiness. And that is basically what the Buddha taught. He said, I basically teach two things, dukkha and the way out of dukkha. If you really want to know the shortest formulation of the teachings, then the Four Noble Truths, of course, you know, the fact of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, then the causes, basically not seeing the things as they really are, which is called avidya, not knowing, but that doesn't mean not knowing geology and, you know, astronomy and all those things, but not to see the things as they really are. That is called ignorance in Buddhist terminology. And then that ignorance leads to clinging and grasping, craving, what we call tanha for things, you know, of the senses, sensual craving, and a sort of craving for fine material things, and sometimes the craving for not becoming, sort of stop the world, I want to get off, sort of thing. When you feel you're suffering, you want to stop the world because this is all suffering and I want to get out of it. But then just wishing it cannot get you there. So it needs something to basically uproot that avidya or ignorance that can take us from suffering to real happiness. And that is basically called wisdom. So the Buddha's teachings also, we could say, even though they were organized in temples and in rituals and in, you know, monks and nuns and lay followers, and his many teachings over 45 years, it is not just kind of theoretical knowledge that he was imparting, but he was always out of compassion for the suffering beings, trying to help them to overcome suffering, for the welfare and happiness of the many. The Buddha actually was considering to keep silent when he discovered Nibbana at the age nirvana of the age of 35. He thought maybe there are not enough people, or who is there who would understand such a subtle thing, and there may not be enough people with less dust in their eyes, as he said. But later on, they say at the invitation of Mahabrahma Sahampati, he decided to actually start teaching, or we could say out of compassion for others. And he went on 45 years untiringly, you know, going up and down the length and breadth of the Gangetic plains around the Ganga River in India and those areas of North India, and teaching to tens of thousands of people in 84,000 ways. They say 84,000 dharmaskandhas, sort of teachings of the Buddha. But it all boils down basically to the fact of dukkha and the way out of dukkha, which is summarized in the Four Noble Truths. And then, of course, if you say that it was a kind of philosophy, yes, it was a philosophy, but with both feet on the ground, not just only theorizing about the universe and so on, but also something practical to do about what you can do in this world. And the Buddha also showed, for instance, the infinity of the universe. There's not just one solar system, he said, not 5 or 10 or 100, but there are infinite numbers of solar systems. And now, after the Hubble telescope, we got to know that that is true. And 2,600 years ago, the Buddha already knew that without telescopes from his own observation. And also even the psychology and the psychiatry that we find nowadays is also almost, unsurpassed in the Buddha's teachings with the Abhidhamma teachings, the higher philosophy and the higher psychology of the Buddha's teachings. The present-day psychologists say, wow, that the Buddha knew these things so long ago. We're just sort of discovering it now. But it's not really that it was not around, but it was not known to a lot of people. And of course in the eastern part of the world where Buddhism spread as a religion, like first from India through Emperor Ashoka's son, to the king of Sri Lanka, Devanampiyatissi became a Buddhist when Mahinda came in the 2nd century BC, 3rd century BC, I think. And then, 2,300 years ago, that is 2nd century BC, and then it went to Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. Of course, it was around India, especially with Ashoka's what you could call missionary zeal of building 84,000 temples and stupas and telling monks and nuns to go ahead and teach it all over the place. So Buddhism spread in all directions. In the western direction also, with even Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and even up to Greece. In the eastern direction also, to China and Korea, Japan, then Tibet in the 7th century, and of course Mongolia and Bhutan, Sikkim, Ladakh, that whole Himalayan area, Nepal itself. So, and that's how even Malaysia, what is now Bangladesh, and then also Malaysia and Indonesia were actually about 1,200 years ago Buddhist countries. And therefore you could say Buddhism was a kind of an organized religion, but carrying a philosophy of truth and of non-violence also. The non-violent aspect of Buddhism is beautiful because you don't find any war fought in the name of Buddhism, or anywhere where Buddhism went by the so-called the sword. It is not introduced by pushing it down people's throats, so to speak, but gradually, if people were interested to hear it and they said it makes sense, then they got convinced of the truth of it, the logicality of it, and found that it makes them peaceful and happy. So the Buddha also even advised his followers in the Kalama Sutta to the Kalama people. He said, don't accept anything just because it is written in the books, or because the majority of people believe it, or even because I say so, but try to think for yourself and figure it out. If it is not against reason, and if you find this is good for yourself and for others, then you can accept it. But if you find it's not, then you can reject it. So there's no compulsion in the religion of the Buddha to, blindly believe it or to by force to accept it, but it is quite free, actually a kind of free thinkers movement. Although on the one hand you can say it has its organized aspects with the temples and the rituals and the priests, etc., and the books and so on. But on the other hand, it is also very much up to the individual to accept it or not to accept it and to practice it. He says, also the Buddha says, that nobody else can really walk the Eightfold Path for you. Nobody else can suffer for you and you will be saved by that person's suffering, but you, not that you have to suffer yourself, you are already suffering, but you have to get out of it by yourself. We are only like pointers to the way. And he's pointing to the moon, but you should not mistake the finger for the moon. So the goal is like to get to the moon, but you should not get stuck at the finger pointing to the moon. So the Buddha was like a pointer of the way how to get out of dukkha and then out of samsara, basically, because samsara itself, as you say, is like the ocean of existence. And he also pointed out the different levels of existence, not only the multiple universes, but also within this universe or within this solar system of ours, you can also distinguish between different levels of existence, what we call the 6 realms, like the human realm, the animal realm, the happy gods, and the devas, the brahmas, then the pretas, the hungry ghosts, then the suffering people in lower realms, people or beings, if you like to call it. And what we can see with our eyes is basically only the human realm and the animal realm. And even we cannot see all of the animal realm unless we use a microscope to see the amoeba, for instance, or the bacteria. But there are such worlds which some people can actually see the beings in other realms, like the Buddha was able to see devas who would come to him. And a lot of the suttas start with, one day the Buddha was staying at Jetavana Ramaya, and then some deva came, or 2 devas, or a group of devas came and stood by one side and then respectfully greeted the Buddha and asked questions about what are the highest blessings, for instance, in the Mangala Sutta. And then the Buddha would preach to the devas. And he could communicate probably telepathically from mind to mind with those beings and could actually see them. It's like a clairvoyant person can see something that we cannot see, and a blind person cannot see what we see. So similar to that, there may be other what you call frequencies that we cannot see with our eyes. We can only see from infrared to ultraviolet, but we cannot see FM or shortwave or microwave or X-rays. We cannot see with our eyes, but that doesn't mean that they are not there. In this room also there are many, many waves that come to your cell phones. I hope you have switched them off, by the way. And the other waves, that come to a television set, if you have the right tuner, then you can see the pictures, you can hear the sounds. But if you don't have, then those are just waves that nobody can see. Maybe they have their influence on us also. And then the Buddha also said, between these different levels of existence, beings go in circles, like they get born here, they get born there, then they go up, then they go down, according to their karma that they create. So, and he also said everyone is responsible for their own karma. But my own karma means that includes karma that I've done in my previous lives. I cannot really know what I've done in my previous lives unless I really remember the previous lives. But that doesn't mean that I haven't done this, that, and the other in previous lives, which is now shedding its fruits or results in this life in the form of happiness and unhappiness. So as human beings, we are sort of in the middle somehow or other. There are happier realms above us, and there are unhappier realms below us. Sometimes you can wonder, the animal realm is supposed to be an unhappy realm, but sometimes if you look at these cats in California, especially in Beverly Hills, they're much better off than these poor people in Somalia. Human being to be in such a place where there's always hunger and strife and conflict, is worse off, I think, than a cat in California. Or a dog for that matter. Well, these dogs are also sometimes treated as if they are, beauty pageant objects, but still. But Buddha said, actually speaking, the human realm is considered to be the best realm. Why? Because it is only in the human realm that we can decide between what is good and what is bad. And we can choose for the good, we can try to avoid the bad, and we can also improve ourselves in a way and also change our karma. even slightly, or we can get out of the chain of cause and effect if we realize what is called the unconditioned, the nirvana. If we realize that, then there's no more rebirth beyond that. Even, well, unless you still have some leftover very heavy karma, like the Arahat Moggallana, for instance. If you're familiar with the story, Moggallana, you know, he was an Arahat. He was not going to be reborn anywhere, but he met with a very violent death, being clubbed down by 500 robbers. And he realized suddenly that this must have come from a previous long life ago, when he had killed his own mother. And that kind of heinous crime could not be overcome even by becoming an Arahat. He had to undergo the results of that particular very heavy karmic activity, what they call matricide or patricide also, you know, killing your own mother or father. That cannot be sort of forgiven. You cannot counterbalance with good karma your sort of little karmas, but the heavy karma cannot be expiated by any kind of good action. It has to be undergone, even if you become a saint. But never mind, he did not react with anger and hatred and beating the others. He just underwent it and passed away. Into nothingness, you could say, in a way. There were no reasons for him to be reborn anymore. So the realms of existence is another teaching of the Buddha, which gives some kind of perspective to us that, you know, it does make sense to do good, and it does make sense to abstain from evil or bad deeds, because basically good deeds lead to good states, and bad deeds lead to bad states. And in the Dhammapada, for instance, in the very first verse, you find that because of our mental activities, because of our intentions, because of our karma, different states follow. If the karma or the karmic activity or your intention is based on greed and hatred and jealousy and ignorance, then it becomes what is called a bad karmic activity, leading to your own and other people's suffering. And if it is based on generosity and loving kindness and compassion and wisdom, then that is considered to be a good karmic activity, and it leads to your own happiness in the here and now and in the future. So all these accumulated karmas are like a mixture of maybe zillions of vectors from the past that lead to a complex situation in the present, and we actually add more and more good and bad karma to that. But we cannot really undo the things which were done in the past, because that's already fixed. And we don't know really what is going to happen in the future. So the Buddha said, pay attention to the present moment. Live in the present with mindfulness and with good qualities, like karuna, metta, mudita, upekha, you know, the compassion, loving kindness, and sympathetic joy, and equanimity, and generosity, and respect for life, and things like that, and trying to follow the precepts, you know, not to do things that you don't want to be done to yourself, basically. And the Buddha gave advice on what is called ethics to his own son, whom he went to see after his enlightenment in the palace in Kapilavastu. That's not one of these 4 holy places, it's yet another place where his son Rahula was growing up. And he said, son, you know, to give you advice on what is good and what is bad, just consider briefly, before you say something and before you do something, whether this is going to be good or bad to yourself and to others. If it's going to be harmful to the other person and yourself, don't say it, don't do it. If it's going to be bad for the other person and only good for yourself, abstain from such words and actions. If it's going to be good for the other and yourself, then go ahead, say it and do it. And if it's going to be good for the other person but a little bit difficult for yourself, you can still consider doing it as a kind of help or a good deed like a paramita to help the other person. So that is very simple advice on what is good, what is bad, and to create good karma and to try to avoid the unskillful actions. And that advice to Rahula those days could even be very useful in our own lives as well. So it's not like these two scouts who were trying to do good every day they want to do a good deed, and in the evening these two boys come together and they say, "What did you do today for a good deed?" Oh, the one boy says, "I did a very good thing." "Oh, what was it?" "I helped an old lady to cross the street." "Oh, very good, very good." Then the boy says, "Yes, but it took me 45 minutes. Then the other guy says, "Why did it take you so long?" "Well, she didn't really want to cross the street." So be careful when you try to do something good. It has to be done in the right way, in the right place, with the right intention, to the right person, the right time, and not to just be a do-gooder and, do it in the wrong place. Like to that old lady, she didn't really want to cross the street. He was trying to force her. So that's no good. So therefore, Buddha gave these practical instructions on what we call sila, then also on samadhi, the mental training of trying to avoid the bad and trying to promote the good, and try to be mindful of what you're doing, what you're saying, and what you're thinking. Body, speech, and mind. And also, he gave advice on what is wisdom, to see the things as they really are. Now, wisdom, or prajna, or what we call tse hui in Zhongwen, wisdom can be seen in different ways and can be developed in different ways. One way is to listen to wise teachings, like Buddha's teachings. You can hear them, you can read them, but the unfortunate thing with listening to the Buddha's teachings is that sometimes the teaching, they go in one ear and straight out the other, and very little remains in between. Like after this talk or after any talk, you might say, somebody might ask you, "How was the talk?" Somebody might say, "Oh, it was very interesting, very good." And then they might ask you, "And what did he say?" And you say, what did he say? I forgot most of it. And that's true, but doesn't matter. At least something is better than nothing. And that is the problem with this, what is called wisdom which comes from hearing, Suttamaya Prajna. It is second-hand wisdom from others. But if you start to internalize that and you start thinking about it and investigate it and maybe discussing what they call Dharma discussions, with a capable person, and then sometimes you can clear up your mind of doubts, and you can sometimes see it for yourself. But even then, maybe at an intellectual level or conceptual level, it's not yet completely realized wisdom, but that we have to do actually through what is called introspection or meditation, and looking inside our own body and feelings and mind. That's what the Buddha said. Be aware of what you're doing, what you're saying, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and then you see, for instance, how all these things are changing all the time, changing, how something that changes cannot bring you eternal happiness. It is kind of conditioned stuff that is rolling on by itself, and you cannot therefore call it really me, mine, or my own. When you see that for yourself, then little by little these attachments and cravings and fears and hopes also tend to diminish, and you become more of a free person, free from your psychological past and the so-called psychological future, and living more aware and happy in the present moment. So in that way we can overcome conflict and suffering within ourselves, and by practicing what is called generosity and loving kindness and compassion in action and developing the wisdom, we can actually come out of this morass of suffering. A little bit like the lotus flower, which is in the mud with its roots in the suffering, sort of in the world, and coming out through the water and then blooming towards the light of the sun and being away and free from even the surface of the water. And whatever sprinkles of water and rain comes onto its leaves, they just roll down without sticking and being carried forward. So, fortunately or unfortunately, everything has a beginning and a middle and an end. And this talk also, I think we have to think about the beginning of the end of this talk, because time is passing. I hope you enjoyed that film, that documentary on the Buddhist places. It sort of set the music and the tone, I suppose, and maybe gives you inspiration if you haven't been to those places to go on a Buddhist pilgrimage one day. And if you have not got the chance to go there, at least you have seen this beautiful impression of the Buddhist places. And then whatever good things that we have heard today, when you inculcate these philosophical things, the teachings of the Buddha into your daily life, then it becomes, actually Buddhism becomes a way of life where you can practice all those things in your day-to-day living, because that is what you are doing most of the time. You cannot only do pai pho, like bowing, or meditation, or rituals. You have to also live your life, and when you inculcate the teachings of the Buddha into your daily life, then your life becomes more meditative, more wise, more compassionate, and in that way more and more free from suffering. You can be a person with wisdom and equanimity and happiness within, independent from the things around you, more or less. So I hope that all these things that we have been hearing and thinking and about and seeing will have created good thoughts and a lot of good karma in your mind, and that all these good vibrations and good energies will be shared by the invisible beings, the helpers, the devas, and also your forefathers, your ancestors, and all your friends and teachers who have passed away, and even those who are still in this world and may be sick and dependent on you, that they may be receiving these merits for their welfare and happiness and their good health, and for yourself also, that sharing these merits with the devas will bounce back on you in the form of good blessings for your peace and happiness and health and prosperity as well. So let us then share the merits by chanting these gathas. Akasatta chabhummata devanaga mahindika punyang tang anumoditva chirang rakkangtu lokasasanang. Akasatta chabhummata devanaga mahindika punyang tang anumoditva chirang rakkangtu desanang. Akasatta chabhummata devanaga mahindika punyang tang anumoditva chirang rakkangtu mang paranti. And to transfer merits to those who have passed away. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. So I just finish with a blessing for you. Sabbitiyo vivajjantu sabbarogo vinasatu mate bhavatvantarayo sukhi digayuko bhava bhavatu sabba mangalang rakkhantu sabba devata sabba buddhanubhavena sada sati bhavantu te bhavatu sabba mangalang rakkhantu sabba devata Sambha dhammanubhavena sada sati bhavantu te bhavatu sambha mangalang rakkhantu sambha devata sambha sanghanubhavena sada sati bhavantu te Nakatayaka bhutanang papaghani varana Parittasanubhavena hantute sang upadave Devo vassatu kalena tassa sampatti hetucha Pito bhavatu lokocha Raja bhavatu dhammiko